welcome everybody to Fixing Revenue Leakage with Your Contracts. As I mention all the time, whenever I talk about legal stuff, there are a few legal people that I really like and appreciate in the space, and Anne happens to be one of those people. Anne and I met a couple of years ago now at I think at the very first Beyond. And Anne's helped us out in the peer groups quite a bit. A number of MSPs that I know have used Anne's services and are super happy with services. So when Anne said, "Hey, I've got some content I want to share with you and your folks, can we do something together?" And I said, "Sure, why the heck not?" So Anne, welcome to our webinar, and do me a favor and tell folks just a little bit about you, and then let's jump right into the content.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Great to have this opportunity to talk to everyone. I really love this topic of, because it's a positive and proactive view around contracts. So it's really helpful, and it can change the way you go forward and really help with the success of your MSP. Just a tiny bit of context around how I came to be here and founding IT Agree. I'd been an IT lawyer for over 20 years. I could see that people did not like contracts at all. I was working on the contracts for large projects, implementation, software development, and I really wanted to bring that to the MSP world. I started going to the US a lot, and that really amplified my view of the need. So here we are, and great to have the opportunity to talk with you. Using your contracts to grow revenue. As I said, it's a really interesting topic. I love this topic because of the proactive nature of it. We've got managed service providers working super hard, and a lot of the time we sense that MSPs are concerned about business risk. And in fact, it's helpful to have a look at what that risk is. So we've set out here the risk landscape. As you can see, legal proceedings, the yellow item, is the one that, tends to loom large in people's minds around contracts. And a lot of MSPs probably think that's what the contract is for. I hope the contract will save us if we're ever sued. So what this landscape here is showing is that there's a whole lot of other risks, and that's probably why MSPs can feel concerned without necessarily identifying what those risks are. So we have things like what's in scope, what's out of scope. We have doing work at no charge. We have the risks around reselling 365 under NCE. We have customers, and what customers are doing is not necessarily what you want them to do. Overlaid with that, we've got, cybersecurity and cyber attacks. And all of these things impact the value of your business. Now, if you can curb some of these risks, you're really getting on top of these areas of revenue leakage. So just to put that in context on a simple slide here, we're talking about how contracts help you manage risk. And we've got two major buckets here. On the left, the risks related to legal proceedings. And on the right, all the risks that, that cause that revenue leakage, that inhibit your financial success, and that in fact don't typically lead to litigation. Most of the time they don't, thankfully, but they do impact your business financially, probably cause you to have a bad day sometimes. And they're the sorts of things that happen daily, weekly, monthly.
Yeah, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but most MSPs don't end up in court. Now, some certainly do, but the majority don't. But pretty much everybody on this call kind of files into the right-hand side of the slide, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're not seeing a lot of litigation with MSPs, but we certainly are seeing a lot of MSPs suffer from these sorts of revenue leakage and so on. So, in fact, by focusing on the types of risks that were on the previous slide, we're really reducing the risks related to legal proceedings anyway, which is a really great thing, of course. Okay, of course. So being proactive about the risks helps to curb any big potential issues. Okay. So what we're going to do is introduce here Rob, the MSP owner. And Rob, he's been working away for many years, working super hard, as we often see that MSPs do, and really passionate about their work. but how can they make more money? Because their profitability is not really increasing. And so what we're going to do through this session is look at the issues around managed services, being clear about customer responsibilities, the dependence on products, which is a really critical dependence that not only your customers have, but you as an MSP. Assessing, your range of services, because most MSPs are not simply providing one managed service, but a whole lot of other types of services as well, whether it's reselling, reselling telco services or internet services, reselling, of course, 365, and a range of other things as well. So then we've got one which I'll need to explain as we come to it, and that's called overcoming the barrier of expertise. I'll tell you about that once we get to it. Looking at how we can make projects more profitable and getting processes and agreements in sync. So Adam, please feel free to chip in, and I'll just go through this, and interested in your pearls of wisdom as we go along. So with managed services, we see a lot of the time that MSPs are bringing in customers and doing quite a bunch of work before actually considering any invoicing. Now, it's not the case that we're saying, charge for everything as you go along, but if you set up and, want to do that IT environment assessment at the beginning, which you most likely all do to some extent or the other, as soon as you touch or look at something on your customer's environment, you want to think about what you need to have in place in terms of what you're going to produce from that assessment work, on what basis you're doing it. You're going to have access to a whole lot of confidential information and data and how things are set up. Do you need to have an NDA in place, for example? But we're looking here at, is this a chargeable activity? And there's a fine line typically between, what you're doing as a sales activity and flipping over into what you're needing to assess, and potentially quite a chunk of work, could be 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours work to really assess that IT environment and set things up so that you know what you're going into and you can provide a suitable proposal. So should that be a chargeable activity? On the one hand, yes, it should, because you're doing quite a bunch of work. And I always say, if you were going along to a new dentist, they wouldn't say, well, we'll do some examinations, we'll do some x-rays, it'll take a couple of hours, and by the way, there'll be no charge for that. You'd be paying all the way from the beginning, right? So should this IT assessment be a chargeable activity? One way you can do it is to show what it would charge and then discount it back. And then, or you could charge for it if that customer proceeds. But what I'm suggesting is put a value on it, especially if you can show a valuable outcome to the customer. Okay. Now, you might not want to give them all the detail of what's in your proposal at that point, because then, you can help them to shop around. And it's not necessary that you identify everything in your stack when you give them that proposal. You can do it in the types of functions that you are wanting to cover off for them. So the level of detail and assessment, though, flicks immediately into that scope of onboarding. And if you've got a strong level of detail in that assessment, you can then identify as you're going through the onboarding process as to whether anything is, out of scope. So it becomes like, we didn't know about that. And so therefore that's an additional item that we need to deal with in onboarding the customer. Again, you might choose not to charge for that additional work, but it's good to identify it. What I would say generally on this aspect of your work and bringing in new customers is that if you start out by giving a whole lot of time and put effort into things at no charge, it does set the scene for the customers to think that you're doing things at no charge, that's the way things are going to go, that some things are going to be chargeable and some are not. So you want to be very, very clear about the basis on which you're going forward, and having a simple work order or a simple form of contract around this early stage is a really good idea. So with all of these items, of course, we're coming at it from a contractual perspective, and think about it in terms of what are you agreeing with the customer. Don't just let the customer make assumptions, but have some sort of agreement in place as to what you're doing, what you're expecting from the customer, whether it's chargeable or not. And even if you don't actually charge, setting a value on that service is a good idea.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I think early in the sales process, or all along the sales process, you want the prospect to agree to things along the way, even like micro agreements for things, because the more you can get them to kind of nod their head and say, yes, I think this is a good idea, and and or this is good for me to know, is really important. And one of the things that I like to recommend MSPs do, especially if you're gonna do an assessment, get them to sign a version of your contract, get them to agree to your MSA, get them to agree to a $0 proposal to do a thing at we would typically charge for this, but we want to earn your business, or do charge for it, and you can kind of go either way. And charge for the assessment. Now, the better and more detail you put in your assessment, the easier it is to scope out your onboarding, right? If you do a halfway done assessment, and then you go to onboard, and that's where you're going to find all the dirt, and that might create some like change orders on the back end, and that could create some problems for you for sure. But definitely want to make sure you're at least charging for the onboarding, everybody. So if you're not charging for onboarding, you probably should.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding those things, and then having that awkward, situation right at the outset of the relationship is never going to be a great start.
Yeah, the last thing you want to do is have a client saying that you're nickeling and diming them at the onboarding level. That's a bad place to start.
You should have known about that. Why did you not when you already done that assessment? So, yeah. So moving on to actually defining your managed service, and of course this is a really vital area, and we do see a lot of MSPs with a lot of grey areas in their contract. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's certainly a highly valuable thing to do. So I would really encourage you to fully invest in defining your managed service. It's not a matter of simply what's in scope, what's out of scope. These are the core aspects, but there's a lot that needs to go into your contract to support, and protect you around both of those sorts of areas. Okay. So the grey areas do tend to create extra costs. We see a lot of MSPs, filling those grey areas with service if things are not quite, certain as to whether it's your responsibility or not. It's, of course, very tempting to just actually go in and take it on as part of your service, but much better, and to actually iron that out before that comes up. One of the things is customer expectations. Of course, customers expect that you're responsible for everything. And so unless you tell them otherwise, they'll have that view that, you are indeed looking after everything and responsible for everything as part of that managed service. They'll make whatever assumptions they like. In terms of detail, it's important that it's a description that a layperson would understand as to where are the boundaries on that particular inclusion. So if you think about it like that, does this actually describe what I'm doing and what I'm not doing? Not potentially not to you, but to a layperson, someone who doesn't, so not an IT expert. Identifying the products supplied and used. I've got more detail around this coming up, but just to touch on that there. The backup, the data that's being backed up, is it just from the 365, or are there other areas of data? Because the customer will assume that all of their data is being backed up wherever it is. The cybersecurity inclusions, again, a common assumption from customers is that, there's probably a much greater protection of cybersecurity that you're guaranteeing than what is actually the case. And we'll look at that in a little more detail as well. On-site work, this is an interesting one. We had one MSP in the US who said, I've got unlimited on-site work in our agreement, and I've got one client who, whenever we do something, they want us on site because it's unlimited. How can we deal with that? Well, it was a simple change, in fact, because all that was needed was to say that it's at the MSP's discretion as to whether they would be on site or not. It's not the case that it's the customer deciding, hey, I want you on site, and it's unlimited on site. So be very careful about that. Likewise with after hours work, you don't want someone calling you at 10 o'clock at night with something that could have easily waited for the next day, but the guy just happens to be working at that time. Okay, so really getting a lot of description and definition around all of these sorts of areas stands you in really good stead. The service levels, of course, and the commitments that you're making there, the way that's all described, super important. So I've just highlighted some of the key areas there. Of course, there are more. We've got a few other factors down below, the NCE payment risks, and this really triggers the topic of, should 365 be part of your managed service or not? We see it both ways, and I was asked just yesterday, what do we suggest should happen on that? Well, we can cater, contractually for however you want to set things up. If you want to have a managed service that's all in with, with the backup service, and your view of the cybersecurity posture that's right under your managed services plan, all actually mandatory and include 365, your contract can and should cater for all of that. If you want to separate those pieces out and have 365 being sold separately and a managed security service being sold separately, also the contract needs to cater for that appropriately. So it's not that there's necessarily a one best solution. It's how you want to run your business and provide your services, but you need your contracts really specifically to support how you're doing that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go, Adam.
Yeah, so a couple of things that I've run into personally on this is we actually had in my former MSP, we had like what was included and what was out of in scope, out of scope, and then we literally had a column in our contract sort of verbiage that was called gray areas, and you could pretty much fit anything you wanted to in the gray area. Depending if you kind of looked at it sideways, you could probably make it happen. And so we actually went through at our lawyer's request to get rid of that stupid gray area thing. So in this case, we defined, what was after hours and what was on, to your point, and the on-site's at our discretion. Sometimes it's better for us to be on site, but sometimes it's not, and it's up to us, not up to you, client. And also for everybody, and on this call, and or that watches it after the fact, that after hours work, you want to make sure that you are very clear about what that looks like, because you should get if they're making you pay people overtime, you should be getting paid for that. That's not just, you're just doing it out of the goodness of your heart. That is where gross margin goes to die, everybody. So be very careful about that. I like to always say that I like to use contracts as a way to be on the same page with clients. And that's one of the reasons that I was so drawn to Anne when you and I were talking for the very first time. And we were talking about kind of how you can use contracts to be on the same page with your clients. So this is a really great way of doing that, as and talking about all of these different things, whether it's on after hours or NCE, or what does it happen when you guys don't pay us on time, right? Those are all really important things to set expectations appropriately from the jump versus after something bad has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's helping the customer to understand, you actually want them to read these parts of the contract. So you want a contract that sets these parts of the contract out super clearly. If they don't read all of the terms and conditions, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but you want contracts that actually bring to the forefront all the elements of your service commitment. You want to walk through your customer with that. As painful as that might sound, the MSPs that we work with that do that, they get really great benefit from it. It's obviously a temptation to sign things up quickly and whiz it out to the e-signature as fast as possible, but that can have ramifications a little further down the track. In fact, one MSP that we worked with, they'd been break fix for a long time, and a few years turned into managed services, and they said, we have no problems with contracts, they're signed super quickly. It's only after the contract is signed that the problems start. So be mindful of that as well. Okay, let's move on. Looking at the other side, the customers, a lot of customers will probably think that they sign up with you and then you're doing everything, right? It's all on you as the managed service provider. but we need to be clear with customers that they have responsibilities too. When they report an incident, what information do you want, so that it's not taking you longer, than need be. Recommendations is probably the big one here. What responsibilities do customers have around recommendations? Because we hear a lot from MSPs, we're making these recommendations. The customer doesn't want to take up the full recommendation, or they want to do it a little later on, a few months down the track, or they want the cheaper option. And this in turn can feel like it's putting more risk onto you. And indeed it does, unless you do something about that and document that appropriately. So recommendations is a big aspect. Things like delays we'll come on to in terms of projects, staff training. If you've got a customer with multiple staff members that don't have sufficient knowledge of using the systems that you're making available to them, or the systems that have been made available from other providers, and they're calling on you for support, some of that could mean they need extra training. Okay, so just think about the customer obligations that, things that you would want them to do that they're currently perhaps not doing, or what you want them to be aware of that they're currently not aware of, and really help to educate your customers that they have responsibilities too. And if they keep their side of the deal, then things will go a lot more smoothly. Someone said to me in a really nice and clear way just a couple of weeks ago, we're partnering with our customers, and that means they're partnering with us as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing to throw out there too is on projects, right? If a client's delaying your projects for whatever reason, and I've run into this directly myself, where a client just didn't do a thing that I needed them to do, made us create a change order and added about 15 or 20 hours to the project, and said, "Look, client, you didn't do the thing that we both agreed that you were going to do for us." Make sure that those things are appropriately captured in your project scopes of work, and that lands in your contract, so that way you can hold them accountable to doing their part, because it will absolutely impact you.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the dependence on products, and this again is a big topic. So what I mean there by the dependence on products is, the services that you provide, you're building into your stack a whole lot of third-party products. You're using products, you're using RMM tools to provide your services. And so there's this huge dependence on products, and we need to think about how that impacts, and think about the hidden costs, think about the risks involved in that. So, who is responsible for the performance of all these products? That's a really critical and key question. Now, if you think about all the products that you're utilizing, they're not your products, right? And so what that means is reflect that in your contracts around, where is the responsibility for the performance, the availability, the functionality of those products. The choice of products, you want to make sure that you're retaining flexibility on that, so that you're not locked in to a particular, endpoint protection product that maybe you want to switch to something else. Do you then need a contract variation? That could become administratively difficult. You want to be able to have that flexibility and fluidity where you need it. So another key aspect, just think about things in terms of, what you need flexibility on, because your contract does not and should not, lock things down where you need movement. Okay, and there are various areas where you need movement, and that your contract should support you on that. Okay, cost impact of non-standard installs. So again, going back to the onboarding, and then whenever you're installing something, if you're installing, into a different type of environment, or that particular customer has got different needs, then think about how you're going to deal with that. And hopefully it's come up with the onboarding, but also what your contract needs to cover off is that, when you install something, it's the price of the regular install, not a whole lot of other things that might be particular or unique to that particular customer. Okay, so again here, just overall with products, think about your role, what level of responsibility you're wanting to take on, and that it really should be what's within your control. not things that you cannot control, like the functionality of the product, the performance of the product, the availability of the product. Okay.
And real quick time check, we're at 27 past the hour. I think we're doing just fine time-wise, but just
Sure.
want to call that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, now we come to the steak and fries, and this is about, Rob going along to this restaurant. The restaurant is actually one in London called L'Entrecôte, so it's a true place, and I was staying nearby to it last year, and I was quite intrigued that every day at 5:30 there was a queue out the door of this restaurant. And, I was in an area where there were a lot of restaurants, so it wasn't like it was the only one. There were plenty of restaurants all around, but this particular one had a queue, and it was really, why is that place so popular? So I had a look at the menu for it, and guess what? There was only one option. In other words, there weren't options. There was one meal of steak and fries, steak frite, and that's what you got. Prior to that, you had a salad, then you had the steak frite, and then there was an option of 3 different desserts, at the end. So imagine that restaurant, how efficient they can be in ordering the products for their meals, in training their staff, and everything to do with that service. Think about then your own services and how many different plans you might be looking after, how many different service options you are catering for with your current clients, and if you can simplify that, you just make it so much easier on yourselves, so much more efficient, so much less training of your staff on all the different options that are going on. And we get people to really look at this and focus on it, and it's often the case that they see a sprinkling of clients on just a broad range of services. Where they think that most people are on one managed service, but they've got all these different iterations. So that really costs you a lot. I think if you are really living the role as trusted advisor, you're going to say to your clients, this is what you need. This is what you need in terms of managed support, managed security, managed backup, and tell them this is how it is. Don't let them start to choose, because you are indeed the trusted advisor here.
Yeah, if you ever hear me talk long enough about number of plans, right? It's you're always going to hear me say I would strongly prefer you get to a single plan as quickly as you can. Now, there are stages in your organization that having multiple plans makes sense, but as you grow and mature your organization, you really want to get down to that single plan. And the key here from you and for your team is to not have a bunch of different tools, right? Maybe the plan that you have, maybe you have one base package which includes all of your security stuff, and maybe no included hours as the super basic, super cheap plan that you're just gonna, but everybody gets all of the same security stuff as they do in your full plan, right? Like, make sure that you aren't leaving things off or picking a cheaper product to fill out a bronze package, because it's going to create all kinds of issues for you. Not only will it be an issue with training your team and stuff, but you're also potentially like leaving security holes open where you don't want to be dealing with that, especially when you're thinking about all things cybersecurity and risk there.
Absolutely, yeah. So moving on, I mentioned at the beginning that I talk about the barrier of expertise. And what this is really recognizing that you as MSPs, you and your teams have, this immense amount of, skill, expertise and experience, and your customers relatively have a very, very low level of understanding of what's going on. So if you think about it like that, you could say, well, that's fine, they trust us. Now, that trust is fine, it's great. In fact, it's essential that there's trust, but the trust alone will cause a lot of problems. So what you want to do is see things from the customer's side, help them to understand your service more. And when you talk to them, when you communicate with them, when you present to them, when you give them a contract, that it's in language that will make sense not only to you, but also to your customer. And when I say make sense to your customer, that it helps them to understand your service more. Okay, so they're not left with, no understanding from your contract. They can actually see from the contract what it is you're doing and what you're not doing. What's your service commitment, the basis on which you're providing services. And this will stand you in really good stead. Some people think, well, the contract, as soon as they bring out the contract, it's full of legalese and it's, that whole legal mystique thing. It certainly should not be that. Okay, it becomes then your contract. You want to understand it. Think of it like, an agreement. What are you agreeing with your customer? Except that it's a legally enforceable agreement. So we get some people saying, well, we're just going month to month. We wouldn't want to lock our customers into a contract because if things don't go well, we're not going to hold them to it. They can just leave. Okay. What that avoids is seeing that you're still agreeing something. We won't get into the whole topic of month to month, which, Adam I'm sure will agree with me on that. You want a longer term, of course, but even with a longer term, people say, oh, well, it's 12 months, but if they want to leave, they can. Well, then it's really not 12 months. And all of those costs that, you might incur upstream with products and so on, you're risking that as well. But the point here is that you want to be very clear with your customers about what you're agreeing. And, that needs to be documented. So think about it like that. Your contract is your agreement. What is it that you're agreeing with your customer? Okay. Really help them to understand.
And it's not just legalese though, too, right? So you don't want to use a bunch of other like MSP technical jargon in your contracts either, right? You want them to be able to read and understand the contract as best as you possibly can, because no offense, Anne, but the last thing you want your client to do is bring another lawyer in to have them have to review it, because the minute you bring another lawyer in, the minute the red pencil comes out and they're trying to negotiate back and forth. And you don't want that either. So make the contracts readable and understandable, not just from legal, but also from our techno jargon, because as a person who has done that in the past, that's just not a good place to be in.
Yeah. You don't want it that they receive the contract and they, whoa, this I can't deal with this. You want them to be able to read it. Absolutely. And, the legalese aspect, that really needs to be addressed. If you've got things that you don't understand in your contract, then your customers are not going to understand them as well. But also absolutely the technical jargon, will be meaningless to them. And they might be a bit nervous to ask because it makes them seem, naive. So you don't want to include that sort of language either, in those acronyms.
Agreed.
Okay, so reality check, I said I'd talk a little bit more about the products and the dependence on products. And in this particular situation, the managed service started May last year, include managed security, there was no contract. Okay, lo and behold, a few months later, a cyber incident, the team rushed in, and this is based on a true example of these people then subsequently came to us to say, how could we, have managed this better and avoided this? Remediation work went ahead and the customer went back to work. Now, the team had worked so well that the remediation and, was all done. They stayed working after hours and got things back up and running. But the customer here was unhappy. They were irate. Why are we paying for managed security when we've then had this incident? We're certainly not going to pay for all those hours you spent remediating. And, so that then immediately also put friction on the relationship. Things had been going along quite well, but there's not only invoice disputes, but the difficult discussions. Okay. And I guess also that lingering feeling, in fact, it hasn't eventuated, but, there could have been litigation as well. So the reality check here is these products in your stack, who's taking responsibility for them? And in this case, it was a managed firewall. We looked at the contract from the vendor. The vendor said they give no representation, no warranty, no indemnity that the product would detect, identify, or disable anything harmful. Okay, think about that for a minute. So that's what the vendor is saying. And I know most people don't look at those vendor contracts, but we look at them, and that wasn't an unusually bad one. They're all much like that. And the reality is that, the vendor is perhaps in a difficult situation because things are out of their control as well. But that's really what they're saying in the contract. So with that in mind, what are you going to say in your contract? And you definitely don't want to be taking responsibility for the performance, the availability, the functionality of those products in your stack, when indeed the vendors themselves are not taking that responsibility.
Well, and if you look all the way back into the May of 2024, without that contract, the client is just going to assume that MSP, you got everything. I don't have to worry about a single thing. They're just going to cover it all because there's nothing to say anything different. So the client's going to say, well, I don't know why someone clicked on the bad link or whatever the thing happened to have been a firewall issue in this case. And if I'm the client, I'm probably fighting that too, right? Because in my opinion, you should have handled it all. You are the MSP, right? This is why these contracts are important.
Yeah, super important. And it's, it's kind of it is a key area. I mean, there are a lot of key areas, but here is this whole dependence on products and how you deal with that in your contracts is really vital.
Yep.
Okay, so we come to projects, and Adam, you mentioned a little time ago around delays by customer. Of course, yep. That is, one of the aspects here. What we want to see is, unless, of course, some people have a, all you can eat type of managed service, but even then, I would encourage you to have projects separate from that, because projects are an unknown quantity. It could be a 2-hour, task that's a mini project. It could be a 2-week task. It could be, anywhere in between or longer. And how could you, realistically put that into your managed fee? So if you treat that separately and get into the discipline of keeping all projects out of the managed services, we do see a lot of MSPs with project work slipping in. And, the 2-hour example is an example of that. If something's out of scope, make it clear that it is out of scope. If you really do want to do an extra 2-hour out of scope task, then document that is out of scope, but in this particular case, you're going to do it. It's not necessarily a practice I would encourage, because you get the customer into thinking you're going to do this out of scope work at no charge. And really, it can become a slippery slope. So if you get your team, your customers all understanding, that it's really drawing that line on in scope, out of scope, and that projects are out of scope, no matter the size of them. And on the size of them, it's still important to have that contract to cover. So just in this context, I'll point out that, it's not the case that you want to have one contract to cover everything. If you start to think of the different types of services that you provide, you've got your managed services, you've got your projects, you've got reselling 365, unless you're wrapping that into your stack. What else are you doing? Managed reselling VoIP, reselling internet. Are you doing any private hosting or anything like that? Managed infrastructure separately, all of these different things. And we see, so many different services that MSPs are providing. Don't think that you're going to have one contract to cover everything, because that just blurs it all for your customer. So doesn't mean, you need a different contract every time you move, but if you set things up and structure it appropriately, then you're going to have the right contracts for the different services that you provide. Okay.
Yeah, and when it comes to projects, this is where many MSPs struggle with all kinds of things, right? And so one, and I think I love your comment around, I wouldn't include projects as part of your MSP, even if you were to ratchet your MSP pricing up. You'd have to be really, really, really good at projects and like never having a project go out of whack, if you ever wanted to do that. Which there's probably, I can count on one hand of MSPs that probably could do that really well, that I've at least personally talked to anyway. The other piece is, for all of this stuff, if it's a project, whether it's a mini 2-hour task or an actual full-blown project. Now, you might not need a full scope and sign off on a 2-hour mini project, but you would certainly want to have that in the ticket, in it, like a approval in a ticket that said, yes, we agreed to that. So that way you're not disputing an invoice later on. And if you wanted to eat a project, let's just say you have a client that's super profitable for whatever reason, which is not a terrible place to be, and you want to give them a project, have them sign a scope of work that says, we would ordinarily charge you $11 billion for this or whatever the cost would be, but we appreciate your services so much, or your being a client so much. We're actually gonna eat the total cost, but like, let them know that they're getting some value out of it for a number of reasons. And again, having signed the scope and all those other pieces, just so that way, again, you are on the same page, especially with projects, because holy crap, there's so many ways that can go sideways on you without having a good scope.
Absolutely, yeah, and and not really not fixing the price on things that are unknown. So allow for scope change, allow for delays, and actually deal with that when it comes up. So document your scope change. Again, it doesn't have to be a huge long document, but you want to document that scope change. How's that going to impact the cost or the time frame? Delays, again, how are they going to impact the cost or the time frame? Okay, so just one final slide here, Adam.
Perfect.
And that's around just looking at that revenue leakage, looking at processes and agreements, because you could have the best agreements and use them for the put in place the best contracts with your customers ever, but if your team's not aware of what you're wanting to agree with those customers, then things can start to fall apart. So, it's a matter of having your processes and your agreements in sync. And that doesn't mean your team all needs to study and read the contract, but they need to be operating in line with what's being agreed with the customers. Okay, so the simple example that we talked about of keeping projects out, to really identify that, so all team members know what's in scope, what's out of scope, that projects are out of scope. And that's just a really simple example. And assessing productivity across your team, which part of how much of their week is a portion to the managed service, and how much time does that leave free, and how productive are they in that time? What is that being charged to? So just overall, I think, we ask MSPs quite often around their revenue leakage. Of course, often it's not something that's really been thought about a lot, but immediately we get an answer of at least 5%. And usually once they think about it, that number goes up. Now, given, the sorts of EBITDAs that MSPs, the sort of profitabilities that MSPs, typically have, if you can reduce your revenue leakage, a lot of that goes straight to your profitability. Okay, so I'll leave you with that thought. I think that brings us to the end, Adam. Happy to have any questions.
Yeah, someone's typing a question in chat here too. But one thing too, as it relates to your contracts, and I just don't think you and I covered it really, is like normal price increases, right? Make sure that you have a plan and a process for price increases. Make sure those live in your contracts, because if you want to give your people raises, or you want to give yourself a raise over time, or at least keep even with the cost of inflation, if that's possible, we want to make sure that you've got some price increase escalations in there, and it's not this big mystery that you guys are all, get all spun up about, right? It should just be part of, it's just part of doing business at this point. So make sure you build your price increases in there.
Yeah, we come across a lot of MSPs that will say that they've not increased their price for 5 years, and then it becomes a difficult thing to do. So it's much easier if you can just increase that on an annual basis, have a process that's known to your customers. This is how price increases are going to work. Yep,
and address it up front, so that way that's not some mystery later on, right? And that last thing you want to do is get the end of the contract, and then you're having a fight about a thing that you could have just talked about a year ago, and it's just an easier thing to handle. There is a question in chat. So the question is, does IT Agree have any agreements for subcontractors? We often hire consultants for projects and need to have them sign sorry, it moved and my brain, I completely lost where I was. We often hire consultants for projects, and they often interact with the customer in some capacity.
Yes. Yeah, so we absolutely do, and you're right, it's a common scenario, so we can certainly help with that, and there's various ways that subcontracting relationship can work. So it needs to be dealt with appropriately in the customer, in your contracts. You need the contract with the subcontractor, and obviously reflected appropriately in your contract with the customer as well.
Yeah, I would imagine there's a non-compete and or non-solicitation clauses, and whose insurance is that in power, and all those other things. There's probably a number of things to deal with depending on the project.
That's right. There's a lot of things that come into it, and it's just important to get the structure right, the framework right, and to understand how you want the relationships to work. We're seeing it increasingly, of course, because as you move into the AI world, for example, but even prior to that, if you've got areas of expertise, you've got the strong customer relationships that you want to, build out the services that you can provide by engaging other businesses to assist, then that's something that can really add value to your business. But you want to do that in a safe and appropriate way.
I agree 100%. One more question in the chat so far. So the question is, if we don't have any price increase clauses in our existing contracts, but want to increase pricing, what's the best route? Do we need to have them sign a brand new contract, or is a written notice sufficient?
Well, it would depend on, how your contract works, but you can always, I think it's perhaps an overlooked thing that you can always agree something different, a variation separately. You can always ask your customers to agree something, and if you reach agreement on a change, then, that can be a valid variation of your contract.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some natural times where if you have a touch point coming up or contract renewal coming up, that's probably the easiest way, I would think. And midstream, like you said, you can always adjust things. Ideally, you're not into a 3-year contract and you're in the middle of year 1 and you don't have any price increases scheduled until year 4 or whatever. That could be a challenge for you as well.
Absolutely. And the time of renewal is a good junction point, and getting in advance, but it depends again on what's in your renewal clause and how that's going to work. With all of these questions, if anyone would like to book a time to discuss the questions or any other aspects, we're happy to do that.
So, Anne, real quick before we wrap up, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Okay, so our website at itagree.com, people can schedule a call from there. We typically do, have calls with MSPs, very happy to chat through your requirements and what you're needing. So that would be the best place. Go to our site at itagree.com.
Very good.
Okay, I should say also that, we work globally, so we have people in the US, in the UK as well. I don't know if there's anyone from the UK on this call, but so yes, I'm based in New Zealand. I'm in the US and in Europe quite frequently. We've got people all around the world. So if you want to go ahead and book the call, we can certainly cater to your time zone as well. Yeah,
and I will state this again, and well, over and over, maybe outside of this call, but a number of peer group members have used IT Agree throughout the time I've known Anne, and I've heard nothing but good things. Everybody seems to really like the work quality. They like the program. They find it affordable, but valuable and affordable. So I can't recommend Anne and her services highly enough. So Anne, thanks for your time today. Thanks for putting the content together. I think this was a great presentation.
And thanks everyone. Really great to have the opportunity to present to you today. And as I said, very happy to discuss with you if you have further questions, or to go ahead onto our site and book a call. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.